Welcome to Phoenix Podcast, hosted by Amin Moanian, where we deep dive into economics and politics.
It seems like everywhere you turn these days, there's another headline about the environment. Climate change, pollution, endangered species. It's a lot to take in.
Yeah, it really is.
And a common thread I keep seeing is that economic growth, especially capitalism, gets painted as the villain. But is that really the whole story?
It's definitely more complex than just pointing the finger at capitalism. In fact, if we take a look back through history, we see evidence of significant environmental damage long before modern industry came onto the scene.
So even before factories and smog humans were already leaving a mark on the planet, what kind of evidence are we talking about here?
Well, think about the shift to settled agriculture thousands of years ago. That transition, even before the invention of the wheel, had a huge impact on biodiversity. Historian Yuval Noah Harari talks about this in his book *Sapiens*. He highlights how early human settlements led to the extinction of many large animal species. That's fascinating. I never really thought about the environmental impact of early agriculture, but it makes sense. Clearing land for crops, disrupting ecosystems, it all adds up.
Exactly. And that's a key point. We tend to focus on the more recent dramatic examples of environmental damage, but the story goes back much further. It's not just about modern industry, it's about how humans interact with the natural world.
Okay, so if it's not just about factories and pollution, what are some other factors we need to consider when we talk about economic development and the environment?
One model that helps us understand this complex relationship is the environmental Kuznets curve.
I'm not familiar with that one. Can you break it down for me?
Sure. The environmental Kuznets curve suggests that as countries develop and get wealthier, environmental degradation tends to increase at first. But then, after reaching a certain income level, it actually starts to decrease. It's like a U-shaped curve.
So it gets worse before it gets better. What's the thinking behind that?
Well, one way to think about it is that environmental protection can be seen as a luxury good. When countries are struggling to meet basic needs, they may prioritize economic growth over environmental concerns. But once they achieve a certain level of wealth, they have more resources to invest in environmental protection.
It's like Maslow's hierarchy of needs for nations. You need to take care of the basics, food, shelter, economic stability, before you can start focusing on the higher level needs like clean air and water.
That's a great analogy. And there's actually research to support this. We see that deforestation, for example, is decreasing and even reversing in wealthier countries.
Can you give me a visual example of this? I'm a visual learner, so I always find it helps to have a concrete image in my mind.
Absolutely. Take the border between Haiti and the Dominican Republic. The Dominican Republic is wealthier, and if you look at aerial photos, you can see a stark difference in forest cover. The Dominican side is much greener.
Wow, so you can literally see the wealth or lack thereof reflected in the environment. It's a pretty powerful image.
It is, and this isn't just an isolated incident. Look at the fate of wolves in Europe. Their populations are rebounding in wealthier nations. Meanwhile, tigers in India and Bangladesh are facing an uphill battle, and lions in Africa are under serious threat. It points to a connection between wealth and conservation success.
So wealthier countries are more likely to prioritize conservation efforts. But if that's the case, why do we still see environmental problems in developed nations? Shouldn't they have it all figured out by now?
That's a great question, and it highlights the fact that wealth is just one piece of the puzzle. There are other forces at play, including the role of markets and government policies, that can either help or hinder environmental progress.
Okay, so let's dive into that a bit. You mentioned earlier that simply blaming capitalism for environmental issues is too simplistic. What's the nuance there?
Well, if we look at something like the Environmental Performance Index, which ranks countries based on their environmental performance, we see that the freest economies, often labeled as capitalist, actually tend to score higher.
Hold on, can you back up for a second? What exactly is the Environmental Performance Index?
It's essentially a scorecard that measures how well countries are doing on a range of environmental indicators, things like air and water quality, biodiversity protection, climate change mitigation. It gives us a way to compare environmental performance across different countries and economic systems.
Got it. So you're saying that countries with freer markets tend to do better on this index. But why would that be the case? Wouldn't you expect more regulation and government intervention to lead to better environmental outcomes?
Not necessarily. One reason we see this correlation is because markets are very responsive to consumer demand. As people become more aware of environmental issues and have more disposable income, they start involving eco-friendly products and practices.
So businesses have to adapt to those changing preferences or risk losing customers.
Exactly. It creates a powerful incentive for companies to innovate and offer more sustainable options, even without heavy-handed government regulations. We're seeing a surge in green products and companies popping up precisely because of this shift in consumer demand.
I see what you mean. It's like a form of economic natural selection. Companies that don't adapt to the changing environmental landscape get left behind.
Precisely. And it's not just consumers driving this change. Media outlets and non-governmental organizations and developed nations also play a significant role in holding corporations accountable for their environmental impact.
That's true. We've seen how public pressure and media scrutiny can force companies to change their practices even if it cuts into their profits. Think about the backlash BP faced after the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico.
Exactly. That event triggered a wave of public outrage and put immense pressure on BP to clean up the mess and change their safety procedures. It demonstrated the power of public awareness and media attention in driving corporate responsibility.
So it seems like a combination of consumer demand and public scrutiny can create a powerful force for environmental change, even in a free market system. But what about the role of government? Don't we need regulations to ensure companies are playing by the rules and protecting the environment?
Absolutely. Regulations are essential, but we also need to be mindful of the potential downsides of excessive government intervention. Sometimes, even with the best intentions, government policies can have unintended consequences.
Okay, that's an interesting point. Can you give me an example?
One of the most striking examples is China's war on sparrows during the Mao Zedong era. The government, believing sparrows were pests that consumed too much grain, launched a nationwide campaign to eradicate them.
Wait, they declared war on sparrows? I mean, it sounds almost comical now, but I'm guessing the consequences weren't so funny.
You're right, the unintended consequences were devastating. Without sparrows to control insect populations, locusts and other pests flourished, leading to widespread crop failures and contributing to a massive famine.
Wow, that's a sobering example of how even well-intentioned government policies can backfire spectacularly. Are there other examples of this?
Unfortunately, yes. Even in modern, more economically liberal China, issues like desertification persist despite significant government control. And historically, the Soviet Union's rapid industrialization under a centrally planned economy came at a huge environmental cost.
So it seems like there's a delicate balance to strike between regulation and allowing market forces to work. Too much government intervention can lead to unintended consequences, but too little can leave the environment vulnerable to exploitation.
Exactly. And it's not just about striking the right balance between government and markets. We also have to consider a potential for corruption and cronyism when governments have too much control over environmental funding.
What do you mean by that?
Well, when governments control the purse strings for environmental projects, there's always the risk that those funds will be directed towards projects that benefit politically connected companies or individuals, rather than those that are truly the most effective in protecting the environment.
So we could end up with a situation where we're investing in greenwashing initiatives that look good on paper but don't actually deliver real environmental benefits.
Precisely. And this brings us to another interesting aspect of this discussion. The rise of figures like Greta Thunberg and the massive media attention they receive. Was it purely organic, or were there political forces at play shaping the narrative and perhaps even benefiting from the attention? It's a question worth pondering.
That is a thought-provoking question. It suggests that even the environmental movement itself isn't immune to political maneuvering and manipulation. It seems like we're uncovering layers upon layers of complexity here.
It seems that when it comes to the environment and economics, there are no easy answers.
Yeah, definitely not. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've seen that environmental damage isn't a new problem. It's been happening for centuries. We've also explored how economic growth, while initially potentially harmful to the environment, can actually become a driving force for conservation as nations become wealthier.
Yeah, it's a reminder that we need to look beyond simplistic narratives that demonize economic growth or any specific economic system. The reality is far more nuanced.
Right, we talked about the environmental Kuznets Curve and how wealthier nations often have more resources and the willingness to invest in environmental protection. We also discussed how market forces driven by consumer demand and media pressure can incentivize companies to adopt more sustainable practices.
And on the flip side, we explored how excessive government intervention can sometimes lead to unintended consequences, even when the goals are admirable. The Spello example really highlighted that for me. It's crucial to consider the potential downsides of government policies, even those designed with the best intentions.
It seems like finding the right balance is key. We need a system that harnesses the power of markets to drive innovation and efficiency, while also having sensible regulations in place to safeguard the environment and prevent exploitation.
I agree. And it's not just about governments and corporations. We as individuals also have a role to play. Our choices as consumers, the pressure we exert through our voices and our votes, these all contribute to shaping the future of our planet.
So where does this leave us? What's the key takeaway for our listener who's trying to make sense of all this complexity?
I think the most important takeaway is that there's no one-size-fits-all solution. We need to approach these issues with a critical eye, questioning assumptions, and considering different perspectives. The relationship between environmentalism and economics is multifaceted, and the solutions will require a nuanced understanding of both the challenges and the opportunities.
It's about moving beyond simplistic slogans and embracing the complexity of the issue.
Exactly. We need to be wary of those who offer easy answers or demonize entire economic systems. The path to a sustainable future will require careful consideration, open dialogue, and a willingness to learn from both successes and failures.
So to our listener, we leave you with this final thought. As you navigate the complexities of environmental issues, remember that it's not about finding a perfect solution, but rather about engaging in a continuous process of learning, adapting, and striving for a balance between human progress and environmental stewardship.
It's a journey we're all on together.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time.